Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. Today in week 5 of the PTS patch notes, we saw more changes to the new Mythic coming, the Torque of the Last Ayleid King. This one started off as a 20% bonus to your damage done and healing, as well as a 20% reduction to incoming damage taken, but it disabled all of your other set bonuses. I think most people thought this set was a bit underwhelming, to put it nicely, but they have come in at the end of the PTS with some more updates to it. So the way that the set will work, it still disables all other item set bonuses, but it gives you 1337 weapon and spell damage, 500 magicka and stamina recovery, and reduces your damage taken by 15%. I actually really like the route they went here because essentially your damage done and your healing are both taken care of by the weapon and spell damage, so those are consolidated into one stat line instead of taking up two. Then in place of that old healing line, you get quite a lot of extra recovery. Unfortunately, the reduced damage taken was brought down a bit to 15% instead of 20%. Overall, it seems like a pretty decent buff. 500 extra magicka and stamina recovery is a fair bit more appealing to me for most setups than 5% reduced damage taken, and I think having access to that can actually turn into a defensive gain overall for this set, which I'll go over a little bit later. Let's start with the weapon and spell damage though. I ran some comparisons so we can look at roughly how big of a damage increase this is. So previously this damage bonus was a percent bonus, so even though it said 20%, if you had it stacked up with other percent done bonuses, this would diminish the relative value of it a little bit. So we would probably have been looking more like a 16 to 18% damage increase from this bonus for most setups. So I loaded up the Arcanist on the PTS, I put him in all plain gear with no set bonuses, and I ran some comparisons to see how much extra weapon and spell damage this would add after some of our basic buffs like Major Brutality and Sorcery and our passives, stuff that we can rely on always being there in our setup as long as we have the skill points spent. So this first setup we'll look at here is not on the trial dummy, this is just self-buffed. Adding in the Ayleid King Mythic, we jump up from 5669 weapon and spell damage to 7621, so almost 2000 extra here after accounting for percent boosts. This could be a little higher or lower depending on your setup. We don't have Minor Brutality or Sorcery here for that 10% increase that you might get in group play, or if you're a DK or a Templar, but we do have 3 Fighters Guild skills, we have 6 medium pieces, and we have the 5% bonus from our class passive. So some setups might have a little more, some might have a little less than what's here, but overall this should be a pretty fair amount overall to expect when accounting for your bonuses. So for this scenario here, this ends up as about a 22.5% damage done increase, and this is the actual percent increase here. Remember that 20% bonus damage done on the previous iteration of this was probably more like 16 to 18% when you added it in with other percent done bonuses. This is already calculated for all that and is the final percent increase. So not a huge buff to the damage, but you should see a little higher results here than what we had before. And then I also looked at it on the trial dummy. Now you get a bit higher weapon and spell damage to start with because of the buffs there, so that brings the value down some, but you also have that Minor Brutality and Sorcery added in now for 10% more weapon and spell damage. So overall, after smacking the dummy, it looked like about a 20% damage done increase from adding in this Mythic, which would still end up as a little bit of a buff compared to the old version. So it seems like they buffed the damage for most situations, with some setups seeing larger increases over the previous version than others, and these increased stats will not only add to your damage but also to your healing. Now I did a few other comparisons to help people get an idea of how much that percent increase is in relation to other common gear sets. So since this Mythic seems a bit more casual friendly, I went with some pretty easy to get sets to compare it to. I started out with Hundings. I just added 5 pieces of this in place of the blank pieces there to see how much of an increase they offered in comparison to the Ayleid set. And that was about a 10.7% damage increase you get from the 2 through 5 piece bonuses on that. The next I added in Order's Wrath as well, so we have both Hundings and Order's Wrath, and this came out to about a 24% damage done increase. So with these 2 5-piece sets, we're already just a tiny bit ahead of what you'd get from the Ayleid King Mythic for damage. So for offensive power, that's kind of what we're looking at here, about like 2 full 5-piece sets from some of the earlier easy to get options. But that's not bad considering we get the defense and recovery bonuses as well. However, you do still have room for a monster set, a Mythic, and an arena weapon in the Hunding's and Order's Wrath setup. So I added in Slime Craw and Mora's Whispers, and that bumped up our crit chance quite a bit to give us about a 33% damage done increase. It's hard to put an exact value on an arena weapon, but let's say about 5% more damage there. So overall, with a full build here that could be pretty obtainable from newer players, we're looking at just shy of about 40% more damage from all of our gear. So a little over 15% higher than what we'd get with the Ayleid King. But again, Ayleid King does have the defensive bonus of 15% reduced damage taken and the 500 magicka and stamina recovery. So essentially, when comparing to a setup like this, you'll be trading away that 15% damage for some defense and utility. Now, of course, there are end game builds that push more damage out than this, especially with trial sets going, probably upwards of 60% additional damage coming from your own gear. But for those types of scenarios where you really need all the damage you can get, well, I don't think that's really where this mythic is directed. But for content that is a bit more relaxed in the damage requirements, I think this set seems really universal. You do lose a fair chunk of damage compared to a fully damage focused setup, but for scenarios when that tankiness and recovery is appealing to you, the overall package here is pretty decent. It feels like a fair amount of stats compared to what you could get putting different gear sets together, assuming you wanted gear that had all of these types of stats. Now, I did mention earlier that this could turn into a defensive gain overall from the previous version. They did knock the reduced damage taken down to 15% from 20%. However, with that extra recovery, this opens the doors for builds to change things around a bit to play more defensively. One option that is really nice, but very hard to sustain, are the resistance potions. These don't have any magicka or stamina return on them like your traditional potions would, so they're very hard to sustain on builds. However, with that extra 500 recovery, I could see some setups being able to swap to these, and every 660 armor is about 1% damage taken reduction. So this would add in about 8% or so, making up for that loss and then adding in a little bit more. This could lead to some really tanky setups, and while your damage isn't the best, remember it is about on par with what Hunding's and Order's Wrath add in, so it isn't as though you don't have damage in your kit. I could see this working even for some dungeon trifecta runs to play a bit safer for those that don't emphasize hard burns as the safest strats. So the question I asked myself when looking at a new mythic, would I use this set? I could definitely see this as a convenience type of set for me. One scenario that comes to mind is if someone wants to PvP and I don't have a character in that alliance set up with the build at the moment. Well, instead of taking a couple of hours to try to figure out a build to put together, I could just slap this necklace on and have pretty good stats overall. It wouldn't be the best in slot for what I could do, but it's definitely enough to have a good time and get by, I think, for the majority of the content in the game. So I can see it for scenarios like that, and also with running alts through dungeons and not having to worry about gearing them out. I definitely can see the appeal here. Now, they did mention in their developer comment kind of who this is targeted for. They said, "We hope that this mythic acts as a simple one and done equip and forget item set that enables simpler solo play for those who aren't interested in the deck building aspect to itemization." And I think that sums it up pretty well. You don't have to think about your build really. Will it get you top damage? No, but it does have a nice array of stats if damage is not the only thing you're concerned with your build. So I actually like the final iteration of this pretty well. I think it serves what it's trying to do, have an easy way to set up, and still have some decent damage and tankiness. However, none of that will matter if the set goes live like it is now, because it is currently bugged on the PTS. While your weapon and spell damage do show up on your stat sheet, they don't actually increase your damage done. I was really underwhelmed with the damage I was getting when testing this, and I just felt like something was not right. With over 9k weapon and spell damage on the trial dummy, I knew I should be hitting harder than I was. So finally, I decided to check with and without it equipped, and sure enough, the hits from my abilities were the same exact amount, whether I had this mythic equipped or not. So it seems as though not only does this mythic disable other set bonuses, but it also disables itself. And those recovery bonuses are also not working. I'm not 100% sure on the damage taken reduction, but at least 2/3 of the bonuses on this don't work as of now on the PTS. I was hoping to try it out for the new dungeons to see how they felt going for the new trifectas, but I won't really be able to do any testing with it. So hopefully they can get that fixed before this goes live. I actually think this is a mythic I have some interest in. It isn't going to be for everyone, I know that. It certainly is not targeted toward in-game rating, but it does seem to fill a niche, and I'm here for it. Especially from a convenience perspective, I really like what this new mythic adds in. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think about this new Mythic and if there are any scenarios you could see yourself using it. Big shout out to my current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. The contributions help a ton to keep the website and YouTube channel going. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougars Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Iffy, Blake1816, Mordecai 1212, Santanico, Vidridi, Florian, Phoenix, Nalandia, Unemployed, Chryseliana, Cha-Cha, Technical KO, Cap, Danco77, and Pletpron. Thanks again and see you later. Bye.